Hey everyone, thank you so much for being here. Before we kick off this week's episode, just a quick ask. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell to make sure that you never miss an episode, never miss out on any of the strategies and tactics that we're sharing to help you continue charting your own path to freedom. And if you'd like to go deeper with any of this, we've launched a free Facebook group, which you can join at pathtofreedom.com/group. And we've linked that in the show notes to make it easy for you to find. All right. Thank you again for being here. Let's drop in to the episode. Hey, what's up, everyone? And welcome back to the Path to Freedom podcast. For this week's episode, we're doing something a little bit different. We're actually featuring a podcast interview that I was interviewed on a few weeks ago with the National Franchise Show. So this is a podcast where I just kind of give a good general overview of a little bit of my background, how I got into franchising, how I started my consulting business, Path to Freedom, talk quite a bit about our experience as franchisees ourselves and some things that we've learned along the way, and really just answer some frequently asked questions that I know a lot of people out there have when it comes to, should I invest in a franchise? If so, what should I be looking for in the right type of franchise for me? And give a pretty good overview of the process that I take people through on a one-on-one basis to, really help them get clear on what they want to get out of business ownership. How do we identify the right types of franchises for them to be looking at? And then, of course, how to correctly do all the due diligence that's necessary. So wanted to share this on my podcast as well. And I hope a lot of you get value from it. And if you like this, make sure to go check out the National Franchise Show podcast as well. They're doing a lot of cool stuff over there. So hope you enjoy this week's episode.
Wes, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Leanne, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Because I know you have a varied background in franchising, which makes you an ideal broker, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you. So as you mentioned, I'm a franchise broker or franchise consultant. You'll hear us referred to in a variety of ways out there. But I got into that about 5 years ago, which was after falling backwards into franchising 6 years prior to that. I went to business school. I don't think the word franchise was mentioned one time in business school, so wasn't necessarily something that was on my radar. But a few years out of college, after working for a big Fortune 500 company for a little while, I met some guys that had founded a company in Wilmington, North Carolina, where I live. And a few years prior to meeting them, they had started franchising that business. And anyways, the business had a startup kind of feel to it. It was much smaller than what I was used to. There was a lot of energy, and I really hit it off with the founders. And so I ended up shifting gears, going to work for them. And pretty quickly into that, I got into a franchise sales and development role for them and was able to help them really grow that into a national brand. And then from there, that opened the doors for me to go work for a couple of other national franchise companies. And all along the way, I'm, seeing other people get into business for themselves and helping guide them through that process. And so naturally, my wife and I kind of started thinking, hey, maybe we should be, looking at this business ownership thing for ourselves. And, we had our first kid, and my wife had been working, full time in the corporate world, but, really wasn't keen on going back to work full time after our daughter was born. And so anyways, we just started really kind of looking at some ways that we could, continue to make a good income and build the type of lifestyle that we wanted, but do it more on our own terms. And so we bought our first franchise business almost 7 years ago now, which is kind of crazy to say. We still own that franchise business today and have done really, really well with it. In that time, we've also bought, built, and sold another franchise business. So we have a little bit of experience on both sides of the table, the franchisor as well as the franchisee side. But it was really all that experience that kind of led me to get into the consulting work that I do today. And I enjoy helping other people, understand franchising. I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there. A lot of people just don't fully understand everything that franchising is and all the different types of opportunities that come with franchising. And, for us, owning franchises has had a huge impact on our lives. It's given us a lot more, control of our time and a lot more freedom in that regard. Also a lot in terms of financial resources. But so I really enjoy helping other people kind of navigate this whole process and figure out if it might be a good direction for them as well.
It's great. So you mentioned in the beginning broker versus consultant. So I've heard broker, consultant, coach. Which do
Yeah.
you prefer so that we make sure we
No, I don't know that I have a preference. I don't know that it matters.
right?
I pointed it out just because I know there's different terminology that floats around. I mean,
Mhm.
a lot of what I do and the work that I do with people is, probably closer to a consultant or a coach because there's so much education that usually needs to take place, for most people to even get to the point of saying, okay, this franchise ownership thing really could be the right move for me. So let's really dive into finding the right franchise and figuring all of that out. I think, like I said, there's just a lot of unknowns or a lot of misconceptions for most people out there unless they have really taken the time to do some real research on franchising. So I think of myself more as a consultant or a coach. I certainly don't take offense to being called a broker either, because in reality, that's kind of what we're doing. We're making connections. We're making matches between franchise buyers and great franchise companies that are looking for great new franchisees.
Right. Usually when people don't know what a broker or a franchise broker or consultant is, they usually liken it to a real estate agent,
Yeah.
help people find the right home. You
Yep.
tell the agent what you're looking for, what, ultimately what your family needs, and then they help you kind of pull down the options for you based
Yeah.
on
It's a really
all.
good comparison. It's a good franchise broker or consultant's going to kind of narrow the playing field. I spend so much of my time developing relationships with brands, vetting brands. I have kind of a portfolio of brands that are the ones I would recommend to someone based on, what me and that individual have kind of decided are the right characteristics of a franchise for them. And they go through a pretty tough vetting process because you mentioned this in your intro. There's a lot of noise out there, and not all franchise companies are created equally. There's franchises out there that in my opinion nobody should be investing in. And so I look at it as a big part of my responsibility to make certain that if I'm recommending a specific franchise to someone, I know enough about the brand, the people behind the brand, and how the other franchisees in that brand are doing in their businesses to feel confident that it's a model that can work. And if the franchisee puts in the work and follows the process, they have a very, very high likelihood of being successful.
It's great. So our listenership is primarily franchise opportunity seekers and
Mhm.
maybe people who have never had one and they're considering franchising and they just don't know. Maybe they're considering starting a business. Maybe they already have a franchise and they're just looking for the next opportunity. So kind of, I know you've kind of high level done it, but break down the role of a franchise broker so that opportunity seekers know, if that's an option for them.
Yeah, so there's kind of three phases to it, the way I look at it. Phase one is just kind of, initial education. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot that goes into franchising that people need to understand and have realistic expectations on if it's really going to be the direction that they end up going on. So, phase one is really me working one-on-one with an individual, get a sense like, all right, what do you already know about franchising? What do you have questions about? And so I've got a pretty thorough process that we go through that's really just designed to get to a yes, is this something that I want to keep, moving forward with, or no, is this not for me, or yes, maybe, but the time's not right today. So a lot of education on the front end. Phase two is, let's really get clear on your goals around franchise ownership or business ownership. What do you really want to get out of owning your own business? What are you doing currently, and what are you not on track, to accomplish that you feel owning the right type of business would put you on track for? Um, and we may get into this later, but I think where a lot of people get it wrong when they just start picking franchise companies to research is they put a lot of emphasis on the product or the service that the franchise company provides, and they don't put nearly enough emphasis on the business model and what their role as the business owner needs to be in that business, especially, what does it need to be in order to be successful? So, I work with my people to develop kind of a framework or a model, if you will, of, what's your day to day as a business owner look like, and how are you spending the majority of your time as the business owner? We want to make sure that, that plays well to your strengths and your skill sets and your interests. And, what are some of the biggest goals that you have? As I mentioned, a lot of times that's financial in nature. Sure, but I find with most of the people that I work with, there's just as much, if not more, of a lifestyle component that they're really looking for. So, let's make sure we understand those lifestyle goals so we can, find a franchise that's actually got a realistic shot of helping you achieve some of those lifestyle goals. So, that's the process we work through, where I learn enough about you to be able to come back and recommend specific brands that really line up with that model or that framework that we kind of work together to build. And then phase three is due diligence. As you can imagine, with any sort of a business opportunity, including a franchise, there's 1,000 questions that need to be answered. There's a ton of information that needs to be gathered. And there's a process for that, but it's not as straightforward of a process with a franchise as I think some people imagine that it would be. And so I really kind of coach people through, how to go get the information that they need to then be able to make a good educated decision for themselves as to whether or not any of those franchise businesses really are a good fit for them. I can't make those decisions for people. That's not my role, to say, yes, you should buy a franchise, or no, you shouldn't, or this is the franchise for you. But what I can do is give them a methodical process to follow so that they're well equipped to make those decisions for themselves. And part of that third phase also includes connecting all the other dots that need to be connected to make owning a franchise a reality. So relationships with funding specialists, relationships with, attorneys on the legal side, with tax professionals. I mean, all the different, kind of experts that one would need to maybe pull in as they're trying to just navigate this whole process. I've got a good group of people around me that are experts in areas that I'm not. So, it's helping connect those dots as well.
That's great. So I'm sure in the process, you see a lot of opportunity seekers make mistakes. What kind of mistakes are they making? It sounds like you build a bench of people that are experts that that you can trust. But what are these franchise or potential franchisees, like what challenges are they finding, and what mistakes?
Yeah, look, there's a ton of mistakes that can happen, could happen, will happen. I've made a lot of these mistakes myself, so that's why I kind of, chuckle as we talk about it. So there's definitely some things that I try to help people, some pitfalls that I try to help people avoid. I think one of the biggest ones, honestly, is they don't keep an open enough mind, right? I mean, this is something I really try to stress to people that, look, if you're really serious about business ownership, and again, like, go back to motivations, what are you really trying to get out of it? But for most people, it's more control of their time, it's more control of their livelihood. Like, making more money is a goal for most people, but not necessarily at the sacrifice of their time and their flexibility. So, you know, with that in mind, keep an open mind as to the different types of businesses you'd actually be willing to consider. Because, I think a lot of people kind of have this notion that, if I'm going to own a business, it needs to be a business that, like, I already have direct industry experience with. And if that were the case, you probably have a pretty narrow playing field of what types of businesses could actually make sense for you. And, the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of these franchise companies out there, they're designed for scale. Like, the franchisor wants franchise owners that have the ability and the desire to come in and build a business that they can continue to grow and build over time. And they're not really looking for a franchise owner that wants to buy themselves a job and, be on the front lines of the business day in and day out. There may be some of that needed in the beginning, depending on the individual and depending on the business, but long term, they want someone that can come in and work on the business instead of in the business. And so if you understand that, then, the playing field usually opens up quite a bit. in terms of the different types of businesses that could be a good fit for you. So it's a matter of keeping an open mind and being willing to kind of entertain options that may have never crossed your mind before. And like, I can tell you that was the case with the the franchises that we've owned. You know, our franchises are in kind of the home service, home improvement category. And you probably can't tell from looking at me, but I'm not a handy guy at all. Like nobody should pay me to do any work in or around their house. And same thing for my wife. Like she doesn't have a background in that, but we've been able to be successful in those types of businesses because thankfully it's never been my job to swing a hammer or climb a ladder or do any of that. So that's a big one. And then, you know, I think like this is one I see sometimes more often than I would like. There's kind of an ego at play that gets in people's way sometimes where, you know, they kind of come into this process, you know, and they're either kind of comes back to open mind, right? They're either not willing to really, you know, admit that, hey, I've never been through this process before. There's things I don't know. So, you know, I'm open to learning. I see a lot of times when someone starts working with a brand to go through the due diligence process where this ego kind of gets in the way and actually turns the franchisor off to them as a potential franchisee. So, you know, I spend a lot of time coaching people that, you know, um, you need to approach this like you would any potential business partnership, because that's what it is at the end of the day. The really good franchise companies out there, they're not trying to sell a franchise to just anyone, right? This is not a timeshare pitch where they're trying to like hard sell you and pressure you into something. Like the really good franchises, they're vetting you just as much as you're vetting them. So, you know, if you have too much of an ego and that continues to get in the way as you're working with this brand, they'll end up telling you no before you would tell them no in a lot of cases. And it happens. So I try to coach people on that. I mean, there's a lot, but I think, you know, keeping an open mind and just really, you know, approaching it like a business partnership, not like, oh, these people are just trying to sell me a franchise and convince me to give them my money, because that's not really what this is, especially, you know, when you're dealing with really good reputable franchise companies.
When you have people come to you and they have something in mind, like a brand in mind, typically I know like the number one search on Google is I want to own a Chick-fil-A franchise.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's,
I did a podcast about that
did
not too
you?
long ago because I hear it so often, and I'm
Yeah,
like, hey, I would own a Chick-fil-A franchise too. You know, if you see their numbers and there's always a line double wrapped around the building, like it's clearly a good business. It's
yeah,
not truly a franchise, at least the way, or
right.
you don't really own a business the way most people would define business ownership. But yeah, it comes up all the time. I so much so that I did a podcast about it.
Yeah, I think it's so funny. Like, I wonder how many times they come to you with a specific brand in mind, whatever it may be, or like, I want to own a Subway or whatever, the kind of just the bigger ones, and then you turn them into like a mold remediation owner
Yeah.
or
Yeah, it's
painter.
probably one of my favorite things about what I do is you know, seeing the looks on people's faces when sometimes I'm first recommending different brands to them, and you know,
Yeah,
something seems like it's coming out of left field to them, and you know, there is some method to the madness, and so much of it comes down to, you know, getting really clear up front on what your goals are and really how you want to spend your time as the business owner. So, you know, this probably falls into the mistake category, but so many people choose the franchise based on the product or the service, right? And like I hear this one all the time too, especially with people that are thinking food, where they've been on vacation with their family, they went to a restaurant, they loved it, and they're like, man, our area doesn't have anything like this, and this would do so well in our area. And they found out they're a franchise, therefore now they're going to come and open this franchise in their town. And, you know, then I talk to them a little bit more and I find out that one of their primary drivers for owning their own business is, you know, their kids play sports and they never get to be at their kids, you know, practices and games in the evening. Yet, you know, they want to open a franchise whose busiest hours of the day are between, you know, 6 and 9 p.m.
right.
That doesn't mesh, right? So I'm not saying food is bad. I'm not saying don't, you know, choose a business where you love the product or the service and would be a customer of it yourself. Just look at all that once you've gotten really clear on these other things. And if you do that well, then you can still, in the vast majority of cases, find a business where you're going to be passionate about it. You're going to be proud of the product and the service that you provide, but it's also going to help you accomplish all these other goals that you have in terms of your time and the financial success.
Yeah. It's like, I know you want to own a Starbucks, but how about this garage repair company?
Yeah, it's fun, right? Open mind, right? Be willing
Yeah.
to keep an open mind.
Yeah.
That's the number one piece of advice. And there's an ROI component to it as well. Like I think
Right.
this is where a lot of people, they just don't understand the full playing field of all the different types of franchises out there. And once they start to see some of these other types of franchises and the investment that's required, and then the earning potential that these franchises have, like it sometimes can be hard to come back around to some of the really big franchise brand names that we all know and recognize once you understand the numbers.
Right.
There's an ROI component to it for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So what should potential franchisees be looking for when they're evaluating opportunities? I know you kind of covered some of these,
Yeah.
but kind of lay it out for these guys.
Yeah, so make sure that the model lines up with what you're looking for, as we've already kind of talked about. How you need to spend your time day in, day out as the business owner can look really different from one type of franchise to the next. So, I always kind of run through an exercise with people. Tell me about your professional career up to date. What are the things that you've gotten the most excited about in your career? Like, what have you enjoyed the most? What do you think is really your key strengths and skill sets? And then also, like, what are the things you've enjoyed the least? What would you say your weaknesses are? And be honest about it. And like, what are things that in a perfect world you owned a business you would never have to do, or you would easily be able to outsource to someone else? And that's how we start to kind of build, this ideal role for yourself as a business owner. So then as you start researching franchises, look very, very closely at what the ideal franchisee is doing day in, day out, and how they're spending their time. And I mentioned earlier that the due diligence is not always as straightforward as people would like, and that's for a number of reasons. But one of which is that the franchise companies are limited in what they can tell you, especially when it comes to financial performance. They can't make earnings claims. They can't make any sort of a guarantee in terms of what your financial results will be. And if you think about it, that makes sense. And there's laws in place to protect the buyers of franchises, because you don't want someone telling you you're going to get guaranteed results when they in fact cannot make those guarantees. That reeks of used car salesman, timeshare salesman. Like, if you really understand business, you know that there's going to be no guarantees. So they give you data that you can look at, and that's a really good starting point to understanding the financial opportunity. But then the biggest part of the research that you're going to be able to do with a franchise is what we call validation. That's when you're going to be able to go and talk to other franchisees that are already in the business, and you're going to be able to learn from them. But where it gets kind of tough is that every franchise out there, I don't care how long they've been around, how successful, the brand as a whole is, they're going to have a bell curve of franchisee performance. They're going to have top performers, they're going to have underperformers, and they're going to have everything in between. And so you need to talk to enough owners to get enough data points to start to get a clear picture of, what this could really look like. And in doing that, you're going to start to identify some trends, right? When you talk to several people that are, performing really, really well in a franchise, but you also talk to several people that are just average or maybe even underperforming, you're going to start to see some trends. And in most cases, those trends a lot of times have to do with how the franchise owner is spending most of their time and energy. And so, going back to, getting clear on what you want your time and energy to look like in a business, make sure it lines up with what you're seeing that these top performers are doing in their business. So I know that was kind of a long-winded answer to that, but the validation is key. And there's so many other things that, besides the financial side of it, that you want to talk to these franchise owners about to really understand this franchise. But the financial side in particularly is important, because a lot of that you can't get from the franchisor. You can't get as particular of answers from the franchisor. But one more thing I'll add to that question, because it's a really good question, is culture. This is not something I see people thinking about or looking at as closely as they should. You know, every franchise organization out there is going to have a culture. So spend some time thinking about like what type of culture would I want to be a part of as a franchise owner, and look very closely at the culture that you see within any of these franchise organizations. And look, we've been part of several franchise systems ourselves, one of which has a phenomenal culture, or I should say it's a phenomenal culture fit for us. The other one was okay. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't great. And we still did well in that business. We were able to build it into a 7-figure business and sell it, within a 3.5 year time frame. But it just wasn't the same as this other franchise that we've now owned for almost 7 years. And it makes the world of difference. When you're part of a franchise that's got a strong culture and you fit into that culture nicely, the value that you're going to get from just the peer group of other franchise owners that you have, these people that are not your competitors, but they're in the exact same business that you are. They have the same challenges that you have. They have the same, issues in their business. Those relationships become invaluable. So don't overlook the culture piece. Obviously, the numbers need to make sense. All these other things that we've already touched on need to make sense. But if you can find that plus a really good culture fit, that's a really good recipe for success.
Yeah, that's great. So you were just talking about franchise opportunity, I mean, sorry, financial opportunity about how much they'll make, and the franchisor can't give them that. But there are fees involved in buying a
Yeah.
franchise, and they vary from franchise to franchise. And so I know it can probably be very confusing for someone looking into different opportunities. So what do they all mean? How does a consultant like yourself help them navigate those all of those numbers that they're
Yeah, it's a good question because there's a lot of, especially if you're just kind of, doing research online, there's a lot of numbers floating around. So the way I always kind of coach people to look at it is what you're usually going to see from a franchisor in terms to the cost is what they call the estimated initial investment range. And it is always a range, right? It's never, hey, this franchise cost exactly X number of dollars to open. It's a range because the cost to open it in North Carolina, where I am, is probably going to be different to open it than, in California or Florida or New York. So there's always a range, but what that range includes is it's really meant to be kind of a comprehensive number in terms of how much capital you need to get the business open and to begin to operate the business. So there's kind of 3 buckets that make up this estimated investment range. The first of which is the initial franchise fees. Okay, so that's just a set dollar amount that you pay one time to the franchisor in order to officially become a franchisee and get access to everything a franchisee gets, right? Access to the brand, the trademarks, the systems, the processes, the training. Most franchises, not all, but most have a protected territory model as well, which is part of what you're getting when you pay those initial franchise fees. And, my CPAs always put that initial franchise fee and the value of our territory as an asset on our balance sheet. But anyways, initial franchise fees are included. Startup costs are included, right? That's any expense that you would likely incur to get your business open. Okay. And then the final thing is working capital. All right. So there's going to be a specified amount of working capital included in that investment range. And that's the minimum that the franchisor wants to see that a new franchisee has on hand as they open their business and begin to operate. So that's important for people to understand, right? Because when you hear a franchise company say, hey, our initial investment range is $250,000 to $400,000, I think a lot of people see that and they're like, well, darn, I don't have $250,000 or $400,000 sitting in my savings account. I can't afford to get into that franchise. And you may not be able to, but that's not really going deep enough to figure out like, hey, is this within reach for me or not? Because the vast majority of people out there are not self-funding the entire investment for a franchise. I've worked with some very high net worth individuals over the years, and they use as much of someone else's money as they possibly can to invest in something like a franchise. And there are a lot of different funding mechanisms or options out there that people are using on a regular basis to invest in franchise businesses. So when you see those numbers from a franchisor, think of that as kind of the all-in investment that's going to be required, but that's not necessarily the same as what you personally would have to invest up front out of your own pocket. Going back to the fees though, because what we just talked about are kind of your upfront fees, right? With a franchise, you're also going to have some ongoing fees, right? The probably biggest of which is what's called a royalty. And this is really how franchisors make their money. The royalty is usually a percentage, typically 5 to 8% is what I see, of the franchisee's gross revenue that gets paid back to the franchisor on an ongoing basis. And then most franchisors have some other fees involved, a national advertising, fee that may be 1 or 2%. There may be some ongoing fees for things like technology or call centers or things like that. That's all going to be kind of business specific, but you do need to understand not only, all right, what are my upfront costs to get the business open, operating, have some working capital on hand, but also like what am I going to be paying on an ongoing basis to be a franchisee? So that's all part of it. And the way as far as the numbers go, it's a very formulaic in terms of assessing, hey, does this franchise make sense from a number standpoint? Because a lot of people are like, well, Wes, why would I want to pay all this money up front to become a franchisee? And then why in the world would I want to give them 6 or 7% of my gross revenue on the back end? And I'm like, you may not, right? Like, this is where the research comes into place. Like, there's a lot of them out there that I wouldn't want to, get involved in that type of a fee structure, because you probably end up making less than you would if you own that same business on your own. But there's also a lot out there where you're going to come out net better in all likelihood as the franchisee. So with the ongoing fees, you just got to look at, all right, what does it cost me and what am I getting in exchange for that? All right. And that's the value add to the franchisees probably going to look different depending on the type of business that you're in. You own McDonald's, a lot of the value add is simply in the brand, right? You can open a McDonald's anywhere in the world. People are going to know what they're going to get, what to expect, and people are going to start walking through the doors as soon as you open. It'd be hard to build that same type of brand recognition for 6% of your revenue every year. I don't know what McDonald's royalty is, but say it's 6%. In the types of franchises that I own, the brand recognition is not nearly as valuable, at least in most cases, but there's tremendous buying power, right? So in one of our franchises, we sell a high-end custom home improvement product, and the franchisor owns the manufacturing company that we buy that product from. So we have exclusive rights to it. They don't sell it to anyone that's not a franchisee. And if I wanted to own the same business on my own and sell a comparable product, it would cost me at least 15%, probably closer to 20% more in terms of my material costs, right? So I'm offsetting what I pay in my royalty just on cost of goods alone. And then there's all the other advantages that we get from a branding, a marketing, a technology, and then the being part of the community, that I kind of mentioned earlier. So that value add is going to look different from one type of franchise to the next, but it needs to be there, right? If you kind of run the numbers, like, I can't for the life of me see where I'm going to come out better after these fees. Like, maybe that's an indication. So I think maybe that's where you were going with that question. So I just kind
Yep.
of ran with it.
So that was perfect. But speaking of money, so I know even before we got on this call, you were talking about a survey that you had given to a bunch of people about funding strategies. And so I
Yeah.
think a lot of people don't understand, like, how are they going to get the money? Where are they going to get the money from? What are the options out there for them? So as a broker consultant, you probably have a handle on a lot of that. So can you
Yeah.
explain that?
Yeah. It's probably the biggest question that people have if they're, kind of considering going into business for themselves, whether through a franchise or not. And I think, this piece holds a lot of people back from taking any, meaningful steps towards doing any real research. So I talk to people a lot about this. And, look, the first thing I'll say is that to get into any legitimate franchise opportunity, it is going to require an investment, and not everyone is going to be financially qualified. But what I find in all the conversations that I'm having with people all over North America about franchise ownership is that far more people are in a financial position to qualify for some type of a franchise than they think. I work with a lot of people that come into it saying, "Hey, I don't think I'm in a financial position to do this," and it turns out they are. They're not going to be in a financial position to go invest in every single franchise out there, but there's low cost, mid cost, and high cost franchise opportunities out there. So common ways that people are funding franchises is, I'd probably say the most common is through SBA loans. An SBA loan is through the Small Business Administration. Banks love to do SBA loans because the government is essentially guaranteeing up to 75 or 80% of the loan amount to the banks. They're backing that. On top of that, banks love to write SBA loans for franchises because, in the bank's eyes, a franchise compared to a startup where there's no track record, there's no data, it's just someone with an idea. The bank sees a lot more security in writing that loan for a franchise where there is data, there is a track record, there's a business plan. It's certainly not risk free in the bank's eyes, but they like to write these loans for franchises. So a good rule of thumb on an SBA loan, it does vary a little bit depending on the amount of the loan and the borrower's credit score and things like that. But 20% is roughly what the bank is going to want the borrower to put in of their own money. So if you compare it to buying a house, it's pretty comparable to that. When you're doing an SBA loan, they call it a cash injection instead of a down payment, but essentially it's the same thing as making a 20% down payment if you're going to get a mortgage to buy a home. So I see people use this all the time. Another one that I don't think a lot of people are aware of is what's called the rollover for business startup, and ROBS, ROBS is the acronym. And this is actually a mechanism where you can take retirement funds that you have, roll over those retirement funds, or roll over a portion of it. You don't have to access all of the retirement funds for the purpose of starting a business. And in doing that, you don't get hit with any of the tax penalties that you typically would get hit with for accessing retirement funds early. So, this is personal. I talked to some people, and the thought of touching retirement funds, like, they're going to have a heart attack even thinking about it. I talk to other people. They're like, "You mean I can go tap into this money that's going to sit here for the next 20 years and not have to take out a loan or not have to take on as much debt to do it?" That's fantastic. So, it's personal, but that's an option that's out there. I see people use a ROBS, a rollover, to give themselves enough money for the cash injection that they need to satisfy the bank for an SBA loan. And that way they don't have to touch their cash on hand or their savings. So, it doesn't have to be just one option or the other. There's a lot of ways that you can combine some of these options. I've seen people use HELOCs, home equity lines of credit on their home. I've seen them use non-retirement investment accounts. We funded a good part of our last franchise through, a revolving line of credit that we have against one of our non-retirement investment portfolios. Interest rates were better than an SBA loan, and I had the money within like 24 hours of me submitting the request to my broker. So, that's an option that can be good in some cases. And one more that I'll point out, and this was actually a big part of how my wife and I got started with our first franchise business. I've seen a lot of other people, especially people that are maybe younger in their careers and just haven't had enough working time to build up any real net worth or any real assets yet. And that's, to find a friend, a family member, a mentor, someone that's, maybe at the point in their career where they don't need to go out and bust their tail physically to build a business, but they're kind of investor minded. They're a little bit savvy. And if you're willing to put in, the sweat equity, they very well might be willing to fund or help you fund, this franchise business in exchange for some equity. And so, my wife was 25, I was 28 when we started our first franchise business. And I had a mentor that, we had a similar arrangement to that. And he still owns a small, piece of that franchise business today. And, we've gone on to invest in other businesses. So I've seen that play out 10 or 15 times, over the last 7 or 8 years, just with people that I've been working with through this process. So if you're out there and you're a little bit younger or just, maybe not in that financial position where some of these other options might be available to you, don't give up. Think if you've got someone around you that trusts you and believes in you that could help you, maybe make this dream of business ownership a reality.
Yeah, I love that there's so many options in franchising, and I think it scares people away when they look at those
Yeah.
initial numbers, but there really are so many great options. Which actually leads me to my next question, which we didn't talk about using a broker or consultant.
Yeah.
What are the fees in using a broker?
Thank you. I'm glad you asked because this comes up all the time. This is probably my favorite thing, or maybe I said earlier something was my favorite thing. One of my favorite things about moving from the franchise sales side of the table to now the consultant or the brokering side of the tables. I don't have anything to sell anyone, right? My time, my services are completely free, no obligation for everyone that I work with. And I get paid by the franchise companies if and when I introduce them to someone that goes on to become a franchisee with them. They pay me a percentage of those initial franchise fees that we talked about earlier. Again, similar to a real estate agent, similar to an executive recruiter or a headhunter and the way that they get paid. And one other thing I'll clarify on that, because this question comes up sometimes. If I refer someone to a franchise company and they end up buying that franchise, the fees they pay to the franchise are the same as if they would have found that franchise on their own. So, in other words, the franchise company doesn't mark up the fees just because they know they have to pay me. A lot of franchise companies out there really prefer working with consultants like myself, just like many corporations hire headhunters to fill executive positions for them because especially in this day and age, there's a lot of noise out there, as we've already talked about. And, a franchise consultant like myself, if they're doing their job right, they're putting in a lot of time and a lot of, legwork with someone before they get to that point of recommending a brand and then referring them to that brand. And so, for a lot of franchise companies, there's quite a bit of value in that because they're getting people that are interested, qualified, and ready to start doing some real research instead of all the other steps that have to take place to get up to that point.
Right. Yep. I know that most people think that that's just another expense. So it's
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, listen, here's what I tell people because it's an intimidating process to start. Like we just think about everything we've talked about in the last 40 minutes or whatever it's been. Like there's a lot that goes into this. And regardless of the dollar amounts, it's a big decision. Like, a franchise is not a passive investment. And not all franchises are necessarily going to require the franchise owner to be like an owner operator from day one, but it's never an entirely passive deal, right? And so it's going to have an impact on your life, your family's life, from the actual dollar amount invested, but also to just your lifestyle, right? Like you go from not owning a business to owning a business one day, like your life's different now. And hopefully if you've gotten real clear on, what you want to get out of business ownership, you probably already realized you wanted to change some things in your life and hopefully you're going to accomplish all of that. But the point is, it's not a decision that should be taken lightly. Me and my family have been through this. I've helped hundreds of other people through this. even, probably thousands of people at this point that I've worked with that have decided a franchise was not right for them or the timing was not right. And I look at that as a win, right? If I can help someone learn enough to say, you know what, I'm not ready for this, or this is not in the cards right now, or that's not what I thought it was, and that's not what I'm looking for, that's so much better than them getting locked into an agreement and, immediately regretting it. So, this is like a process where I've got to do my best to educate, give people a methodical way to navigate it, but also meet them where they are, right? Like, and it's why I didn't get into this until we had other businesses and other steady revenue streams set up, because, you know, it's not my role to make these decisions for people. And if I get to a point where I'm looking at someone across the table that I'm working with as a potential commission and not, a human being that's, going through, some very big decision making processes, that's not a good place to be for me or for the people that I'm working with. So, you have to meet people where they are. And that's what I like about, the way I'm able to run this business is, there's no shot clock on it. There's no deadlines. I mean, I've got people that I work with off and on for 2 years, 3 years until the timing's right and we find the right opportunity for them. So, hopefully that maybe, makes this whole process a little less intimidating for some of those listening. There are people out there that, have real experience that they're willing to share. And yeah, it's a business, but it's not a high pressure type of thing, or at least it shouldn't be, and it doesn't have to be.
Right. It's emotional decision too.
Very.
So we got time for one more question, and
All right.
I like this one because I'd love to hear your perspective. So what are the most recent current trends that you're seeing in franchising or franchise industry?
Okay, that's a good one. So trends in franchising. All right, here's one that I don't know that it's a good trend. I kind of mentioned earlier that not all franchises are necessarily going to require like full-time owner operator time investment from the franchise owner. So there's this term that you hear a lot in franchising called semi-absentee or semi-passive, right? I said earlier, owning a franchise is not a passive investment, and it never will be. But you hear this terminology float around a lot, semi-absentee or semi-passive. And, essentially what that is franchise companies marketing themselves or trying to communicate that, hey, if you're a corporate executive or a mid-level manager with a good job and good benefits, and you don't want to walk away from all of that today, but the idea of owning your own business is appealing to you, you can do that with our franchise. Okay. That's what they mean when they say semi-absentee. And look, people do that and do it successfully pretty often, all the time, really. Okay. But here's what people need to understand about these, because I know the first questions that come to mind when a franchise tells you that they're semi-absentee. Okay, great. Well, like how many hours a week are we talking? And so then how much of my time am I going to have to invest? Like, how much is this going to get in the way of my full-time job, and how much money can I make? And so naturally, companies want to be able to answer these questions. So you'll hear things like, oh, it's a semi-absentee investment, 2 to 5 hours a week. And just trying to give nice, neat, clean answers like that. And the reality of it is, like, when you own a business, right, semi-absentee, owner operator, like, put any of the titles on it that you want, the buck stops with you as the business owner. And so, businesses don't always run in these nice little neat boxes where it's like, okay, you've put your 5 hours a week in, so nothing else that you need to do this week, Mr. Business Owner. It doesn't work like that. So I want people to come in eyes wide open. Yes, there's a lot of franchises out there that are really actually designed for the corporate professional that's, developed a great skill set that translates very well to owning their own business, especially within the framework of a good franchise. And they can do that in many cases without having to leave that corporate job. But it's not always going to be the exact same thing every single week. And you have to be prepared to potentially make some tough decisions, right? Because really, when they talk about semi-absentee ownership, they mean it's a manage the manager business model, right? So if you as the franchise owner are not in the business day in, day out managing it, someone needs to be. So it's the type of model that lends itself to being able to hire and train a manager and kind of put them in there from day one. And then that manager is going to report up to you as the franchise owner. And so again, you may have to make tough decisions at some point, like, hey, my business needs more time out of me this week. My corporate job needs more time out of me. How am I going to make those decisions? Right? What happens if you lose a manager? Right? Again, none of this is impossible. People do it all the time. But that's the other, point I really try to stress with people is like a lot of this depends on you, and it depends on your strengths and your skill sets as a manager. What type of experience do you have building, managing, leading teams? Because I've seen people that are phenomenal at that, and they could probably have two corporate jobs and seven franchise businesses going at any time and not miss a beat because they're that good at building and managing teams. And I've seen other people that they can't do it with one franchise and a corporate job. So there's a lot of that goes into it. Just because a franchise says we're semi-absentee and it's 2 to 5 hours a week, dig deeper than that.
That's a really great point. It drives me crazy when people automatically are searching for a no absentee or
Yeah, it's
semi-absentee. If they're not like the investment model and they don't have, layers of, usually big multi-unit people, of course,
yeah.
but
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different models. There's so many different, pathways to get into franchise ownership, and then the types of doors that can open, once you're successfully owning a franchise. But the point is it's owning a business at the end of the day. If it sounds too simple or too good to be true, that means you need to dig a little bit deeper. And it doesn't mean it's not a good opportunity. It just means, you need to dig a little bit deeper and do everything you possibly can to come into it eyes wide open. And so a lot of the due diligence is about understanding, what could go wrong and thinking about, all right, how would I handle this if it did go wrong? Right. And if you can get comfortable having kind of looked at it through that lens, then that's a pretty good indication.
yeah. All right. Well, I think our time is up. This has been super
Yeah.
informative.
Thank you
And
for all the time. I
yeah,
appreciate
no,
it.
this was so great. And I think really hopefully opens opportunity seekers' eyes to the options that are out there for them.
Yeah.
They're not alone, they're not on an island. They do have professionals like yourself that can help kind of navigate the chaos and
Yeah.
like you said, break through the noise. So
It
where
is. It is
where can people
chaos.
find you? Yeah. Where can
Um,
people find you?
yeah. So my company is Path to Freedom, with the number 2. Pretty active on LinkedIn. I do a podcast and a YouTube channel called the Path to Freedom podcast. So I think maybe we can make sure you have links. That's on Spotify, Apple, anywhere you listen to podcasts, and we put the full video version of all of that, plus some additional video content out on YouTube. And look, I've got time for anyone, that is just genuinely curious about franchising, business ownership, whether you consider yourself a serious prospective buyer or not. I've got time for anyone that has questions and just wants to better understand some of this. So, if it's okay, I'd love to, put my Calendly link in the show notes for this, and would encourage anyone that's interested, book a 20-minute call with me and let's talk through it. And would love to help if I'm in a position to. And I think franchising is a really good way for so many people to get started in business ownership. I know it has been for my wife and I, and it's opened up so many doors since we took that first step and bought our first franchise. And some of that's been more franchising, some of it's been non-franchise stuff. So there's a lot of cool things that can happen once you kind of take that first step into business ownership. And I work with a lot of people too that they're successful business owners. They did it with with another franchise or without a franchise, but a franchise can be a great way to diversify too. A lot of times it's my startup business owners that see the most value in a franchise because they've been through all the hard work of figuring it out themselves already, and they're like, wait, the franchise has got all this in place already, and it's kind of turnkey and with some of these things. So it's pretty rare that I run into someone that's genuinely motivated to get into business for themselves, and we can't find at least a handful of franchise opportunities that are at the very least very interesting for them.
Mhm. All right, well, we'll be sure to include all of that in the show notes. And thanks again for coming on our new podcast, the National Franchise Show.
My pleasure. Love the show, and thank you.